So this is the Bisexuality in the Life course Part 2 session, and we're going to be hearing from lots of exciting speakers talking on topics from bisexual couples to parenthood to plurisexualities and non-monogamies. So we're covering a broad range of topics, and I'm really looking forward to this session. So I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Mary Nedela, who is an assistant professor and clinical coordinator in the marriage and family therapy program at the Central Connecticut State University in the US, and is also a licensed marriage and family therapist. She's particularly passionate about LGBTQ individuals and their relationships with family, friends, and partners. Additionally, she's driven to increase the quantity and quality of clinical services available to LGBTQ+ communities. Her specific research area of interest includes relational well-being among bisexual individuals and their partners. And Mary, I'll just pass over to you.
Hi, thank you. I'm so excited to be here. So I have a topic that I'm presenting today is my dissertation topic that I did a study on, and it's going to be a feat to put all of that into a very short period of time. But what I actually really want to do is focus on being able to have some conversations about it, if we can, you know, kind of basically getting some feedback from y'all. I'd love to continue this study and to broaden, you know, the research on this topic. So as a kind of template, what I'd really love to do is just kind of share my, oh, if I can find it first, share my, an overview of my, my study very quickly, and I'm not finding it on my, oh, here it is. Okay, sorry about that. Okay, so there's a lot of information in here, and what I really want to do is just kind of breeze past kind of some of the background and significance, and just tell you a little bit about the sample. And as you can see, 8 couples is not a lot, so this is really why I want to expand this and you know, start to work with more couples and see kind of if this kind of emerging model is something that is applicable to lots of different couples. So I interviewed, this is a qualitative study, I interviewed 8 couples and did 15 dyadic interviews. So I interviewed the couples together. They were predominantly cisgender females. We did have 1 trans female partner, and a lot of them were highly educated, had at least some level of education. You can see a little bit of the breakdown of the demographics here. We did have the majority of couples were from the US, so it kind of very contextual in that way. We did have 1 couple from Australia as well. So what I want to do is I'm going to zoom in, and hopefully you can all see, and come down here to the model really quick, and I'm just going to kind of go over a little bit of kind of what the findings indicated. And this is, again, 200+ pages of writing down to a very short period of time to kind of dive into it. But this is generally what I found from working with the and talking with these couples. And the goal of this study was to understand how couples navigated attitudes regarding bisexuality and how that impacted their relationship, if at all. So those were the guiding kind of influences here, and really wanting to understand what their relational processes were. And so what I found was that this tends to kind of be kind of stage-wise or phase-wise, and where it kind of starts is this kind of like pre-relationship stuff, you know, so the things that are happening before the relationship even starts heavily influences how we think and feel about bisexuality. And so there were a lot of lesbian partners, for instance, who had a lot of these kind of preconceived notions about what it meant to be bisexual. And then there was a lot of fears about that and whether or not they even wanted to be in the relationship to begin with. And so there was also some things about, you know, like how they disclosed to their families about bisexuality, or even their own identities, or what that looked like. And just kind of general influences, like from society, from media, from, you know, people out there about what it means to be bisexual. So all of those factors kind of really mattered before even coming into the relationship, because it really sets a stage for, what do I even think about that? What do I think about bisexuality and being in a relationship with a bisexual person? And then as the formation of the relationship kind of started, there was a lot of kind of working with these insecurities and kind of bringing some of those fears into the relationship, in addition to general stressors about starting a relationship and what does that look like, and figuring out if this is a relationship that is going to work out for me. Do I want to stay in this relationship? And so once they kind of figured that out, and you know, to be fair, this group of folks, they all decided to stay in the relationship. So I don't really know what it looks like for people who don't decide to stay in the relationship. And that's something I'm very interested in. But once they decide that, there's a lot of relational work that they engage in. So there's a lot of communicating and communicating about communicating, right? What does it look like to be in this relationship, and to kind of address these fears that I have, and you know, figuring out what boundaries we have. Are we going to be monogamous or non-monogamous? How are we going to make rules around, you know, how much influence our family has or influence other people have in our relationship? And there was a lot of self-reflectivity about, okay, so maybe I need to think differently about bisexuality now. Now I'm actually in a relationship with a bisexual person, and okay, maybe it's a little bit different than what I thought it was. And then also learning about it from their partners, from other people. And over time, as that sort of starts to develop, there's also a stronger commitment that has been made. So there's a lot of these processes that kind of interrelate with each other in this phase of kind of what I call a relational emotion work. And through some of that, there's a bit of a shifting of attitudes. And then there's kind of a working phase or maintenance phase of the shared relational meaning, where there might be things that come up like, you know, okay, now I'm in this monogamous relationship. They were all monogamous. And now, you know, I feel erased as a bisexual person, and I don't see my identity anymore. And okay, so how do I keep that alive? And how do I honor who I am, if that's relevant to who I am? And also, you know, sometimes fears will pop up again, you know, because we're human and we don't always get rid of all of those fears. So, you know, what happens when that comes up, and how do we also, you know, present ourselves to other people? You know, are we a bisexual couple? Are we a lesbian couple? Are we just a gay couple? Whatever, how are we? And how do we relate to each other in public and in public atmospheres and environments? And a maintenance of commitment over time. And that all is what I had found is so many processes that then feed into relationship satisfaction. And folks are able to navigate those processes well, then their relationship satisfaction is very strong. So that's a very, very, very brief overview of that. And what I forgot to mention was that there's also these at the top, these macrosystemic oppressions in you know, understanding that they see all of that. They see that there is this kind of you know, these forces that could be impacting them, you know, like marriage equality, and is that going to be taken away, or, you know, is it even relevant to us, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of awareness of that macrosystemic oppression there as well. So there's quite a bit of, and I will make sure to share this if anybody is interested in that, but make this a little bit smaller and move it over. But generally speaking, there's, you know, I have some, you know, some general impressions and implications, as well as implications for clinical work. But what I'd really love in the remaining time that we have, I think I have 5 minutes. So I'd love to just kind of get some feedback. What do you all think about this? you know, where are some good directions for future research? I have some of my own ideas, but I'd love to continue doing this research with various different groups, not just female identified folks. So I'd love to hear from y'all what you think and where should I go in the future? I'm going to stop sharing also so that I can see folks.
Thank you so much for that. That was really interesting. And I'd just like to invite everyone to pop their questions or comments or directions for future research in the chat, or you can unmute yourself and talk. I can obviously put my bit in, but I feel like I've spoken far too much today already. So please, somebody say something that is not me.
I do see a question in the chat, and it's curious about what ruptures occur in these relationships in regard to bisexuality and how they are repaired. And that's an excellent question. So it predominantly is around those fears of, it's kind of like a jealousy plus like insecurity, and that's really around what it is, in addition to kind of like stereotypes, belief in stereotypes, and kind of like an identity attack almost. So those are kind of the two big areas. And so when those things happen, what the couples have shared with me is that that there's a lot of communication about it. They engage in a lot of, you know, conversations and kind of reassurances, right? So I'm not going to go cheat on you with somebody. I'm committed to you. Just because I am attracted to another gender doesn't mean that that's something that I want right now. So those are, you know, it was a lot of conversations. And when there was fights, you know, about those things, then there was also moments afterwards that they were very careful about how they interacted afterwards. So if we got in a fight, okay, now we're going to do something together that's like, you know, kind of bringing back the love in the relationship and bringing back, you know, the compassion and doing something fun or funny or, you know, something like that. So those are some of the things that they spoke about.
We have a few more minutes if someone has one more question, maybe to ask Mary. Okay, I guess we can move on to our next speaker, and then maybe some questions will come up at the end that might be shared between people, or we can have a joint discussion if we have time at the end. So our next speaker is Nicole Brader. Peter, can you please mute yourself? You keep coming off mute by accident, I think. Sorry. And so we have Nicole, who has a PhD in sociology and methodology of the social research. And they are a queer, trans feminist and anti-speciesist activist. They dedicated their PhD project to the exploration of theories and practices of consensual non-monogamies in Italy, and currently work at the University of Turin in Italy. Their research interests include social constructions of genders, sexualities and health, non-normative intimacies, plurisexualities, intersex bodies, and medicalization of sexual differences. So Nicole, I'll pass over to you now.
Thank you very much, and hello to everyone. I'm going to share my slide. Okay. You can see the slide? Yeah. Okay. So today I will start with the research I conducted for my PhD project on theories and practices of consensual non-monogamies in Italy between 2016 and 2020, because some of the research findings I think are also relevant for plurisexual people and plurisexual research. My aim is also to do a new wave of interview this year, hopefully, to try to carry on out a longitudinal study. The research had an inductive approach and insider perspective. In fact, I was already familiar with the polyamorous community for around 5 years. The data have been collected from October 2017 to July 2018. I used the expression consensual affective non-monogamies to label the practice or possibility to have multiple intimate relationships at the same time, and with the awareness and the concept of all the people involved. This definition follows the definition of polyamory, but many of my interview partners didn't feel comfortable with the use of the term polyamorous, so I chose to use a broader term. The research was articulated in 3 work packages. The first one was the study of public discourses on polyamory and relationship anarchy. The second one was the study of online discourses, in particular the 2 main Facebook groups of the Italian polyamorous community, and participant observation during the events of the local polyamorous groups in different Italian cities. And finally, I have conducted 60 face-to-face in-depth interviews all around Italy with people who have or have had at least 2 affective relationships at the same time, and with the knowledge and consent of everyone involved. So coming to some of the results, this is first of all, among the 60 people I interviewed who were not selected on the basis of sexual or romantic orientation, the 43% defined themselves as bisexual or pansexual. And if we add the 15% of people who define themselves as heteroflexible or questioning, and the 2% who do not use any label, we can see that more than half of the sample define themselves with a non-monosexual label. And even with regard to gender identity, the 15% use a non-binary label to define themselves, and so a significant percentage, considering that they live in a strongly binary culture. Now, since one of the most persistent stereotypes about bisexuality revolves around the notion that bisexual people must have relationships with more than one sex or gender to feel complete and satisfied, one might expect it to have been the plurisexual orientation to orient to affect the tendency to have multiple relationships. But on the contrary, just 3 for my interviewee reported a narrative that approached this pattern, while there were far more narratives that presented the exploration of plurisexuality as running parallel with the exploration of consensual non-monogamy, or they presented the exploration of non-monogamy as an incentive to explore also plurisexual orientation and practices. For 2 people, the exploration of non-monogamy, consensual non-monogamy, had gone hand in hand with the exploration not only of plurisexuality, but also of their gender identity. Then some people emphasize the important role of the polyamorous community, which provided a space in which to encounter and experiment with practices outside heteronormativity, compulsory monogamy, and cis-normativity. At the time of the interview, spaces for meeting and confronting with other plurisexual people were very few in Italy. whereas in recent years they have fortunately been growing. And therefore, in the absence of these spaces, the polyamorous community represented for some people also a space where they could express their orientation. And this was also because some had also experienced biphobia in LGBT spaces. However, not all the interviewees perceived the polyamorous community as strongly bisexual. For example, Marta said, bisexual people don't seem to be many. I mean, they do it at the level of erotic games, right? In short, maybe at sex parties, but always oriented with within their relationships with their male partners. On closer inspection, however, her judgment about women in the community who called themselves bisexual may have at least partially been the effect of internalized behavior that led her to consider only a restricted category of people as true bisexual. Okay. The intersection, sorry. The intersection between plurisexuality and non-monogamy is perceived as threatening to the social order because both the identities and practices represent also a challenge to monosexism, compulsory monogamy, and more generally to the dichotomous thought. For this reason, both identities and practices suffer a strong social stigma. And so to defend themselves against this stigma, the respective community have often used the strategies that run the risk of creating new normativities within the communities. We can call these normativities polynormativities and binormativity, sorry. Polynormativity can be defined as any discourse defending polyamory as the right, best, or superior way of intimate relating, and often consists of distancing oneself from other forms of non-monogamy, especially those that focus on sexual experimentation or promiscuity, such as casual sex or swinging, or that are not ethical, such as infidelity. And also to center the narratives on love and on intimacy instead of on sex. Instead, binormativity can be defined as the normalization of a certain standard of bisexuality against which all other forms of bisexuality are measured, and often consists of rejecting the common stereotypes of bisexuality, highlighting instead the people's success in maintaining happy, exclusive, and committed relationships for a long time. So, some conclusive remark. My exploration of theories and practices of consensual non-monogamy in Italy confirms that there is a strong interconnection between plurisexuality and consensual non-monogamous practices. But this intersection of the two identities and practices often gives rise to the amplification of stigma, to which the community often respond with polynormativity and binormativity as defensive strategies. It is important, however, to grasp and highlight the transformative and subversive potential of this intersection. Indeed, it also contains the potential to challenge some of these new normativities. The figure of the good polyamorous or the good bisexual remove only the stigma from those who adapt to the status quo, but they at the same time weaken the transformative power of the struggle. strengthening dominant mononormative and heteronormative narrative. So what I opt for is the strengthening of a counter-normative alliance with other community and movement, such as the trans and non-binary movement and community, queer, asexual, decolonial, disability, anti-speciesist, in an anti-essentialist and anti-dichotomous way, but also without losing the anti-assimilationist and anti-capitalist component, which was fundamental for the queer movement at the beginning, but which is often watered down in contemporary uses of the term. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nicole. That was such an interesting talk. Does anyone have any questions for Nicole? You can pop them in the chat, or you can pop your hand up, or just unmute yourself. I mean, maybe it's best if we wait to do questions at the end, seeing as people don't seem to have questions right now, and maybe when we've had all 4 talks, there might be some common ground that people want to discuss. So we can just move on to our next 2 speakers, who are my lovely colleagues from UCL, Kate and Mark. Kate is a non-binary and genderqueer postgraduate researcher studying at UCL, as I said, with a focus on LGBTQ reproductive health and parenting. And their PhD project focuses on assessing the roles of resilience and vulnerability in birth outcomes. And Mark is also doing a PhD at UCL and is a social psychologist. Mark's research interests center around improving mental health and the general well-being of minority and marginalized groups. And today they'll be presenting about imagined futures of bi or plurisexual emerging adults in the UK.
Thank you, Ellen. So I'm Kate, and I'll kind of get us started talking a bit about the background of what has led to us asking the question that we asked. And so with the intersection of the research that Mark and I do, we got to talking about taking advantage of being able to ask some folks around parenting intentions and stuff, because what's seen in the literature, especially with emerging adults, which is 18 to 29, kind of looking at folks in that age range and their parenting expectations, we can see in heterosexual samples that it's people who often are shaped. There's decisions because of the normative expectations and the gendered expectations around parenting, leading to then parenting intention, with some potential delays related to the economic side of stuff. There is some research that looks at parenting intention in lesbian and gay adults and couples, but again, it's typically a broader age range, as well as in that sample that's relevant, there's a shift that's happening too. So what might that mean for plurisexual folks? And really, I think a lot of the talks today have echoed this as well, being able to kind of see what's in the literature, see what's in the research, that we do need more research that's centering and more in-depth and comprehensive about bi and plurisexual parenting. So I'll pass over to Mark.
Thanks, Kate. Yeah, so what Kate and I then did, we agreed on this project as an important thing to look at. So what we did was that we included some questions into my PhD just prior to me collecting some of my qualitative data. So before going into my interview section of my wider PhD. So my wider PhD is looking at emerging adults, 18 to 29-year-olds, that identify with a plurisexual identity. So I'm looking at bisexual, pansexual, and queer. And the reason for my PhD, just to set the context a bit, is, as I'm sure most of you are aware, young people are much more likely to identify as LGBTQ compared to previous generations. And within that LGBTQ community of young people, the vast majority these days now identify with a plurisexual identity. So within the community, it's very much shifting toward more and more people identifying as plurisexual. Unfortunately, we also know from a lot of research that the mental health in the plurisexual identity community is worse than amongst gays and lesbian, and us as a community as a whole, which I'm sure, again, most people know, is worse than the general population due to minority stress. So my wider PhD research project is looking at why there is more mental health problems amongst plurisexual emerging adults and what we can do to address that. So within that, a part of my study was looking at conducting interviews, which if you take me to the next slide. So I was conducting a number of interviews to understand my main research questions in my PhD. So we added a couple of questions to my interview schedule that related to this project that me and Kate shared. So our main research question for this specific project that sits within my PhD research, so to speak, was how do plurisexual, bisexual, pansexual, and queer identifying emerging adults imagine their future families? So at the end of our interviews, we asked a few questions relating to their imagined future. I conducted a total of 27 interviews. They were face-to-face at UCL here in London, UK, where we are based. They were conducted just before COVID-19 hit. So I started on them in January, February, and then COVID started, and it got increasingly difficult to make these face-to-face interviews. And they needed to be face-to-face because we did four different actually exercises that were done with a paper and pen in front of us. So there was a real importance to doing them face-to-face. So it ended at 27, whilst the original number was, my intention was to make 45 interviews, but we stopped at 27. And there was a lot of discussions back and forth whether to continue after COVID-19, but there were so many things that had changed, particularly relating to perhaps mental health for the potential participants, that it would be very difficult to combine the data from the pre-COVID-19 interviews with the post-COVID-19 interviews. So instead, we did 27 interviews, and we include these extra questions relating to future families and thoughts around that. And since then, we have analyzed that part of the transcript specifically for this project between myself and Kate, and we've applied content analysis to that bit of the transcript. So what we will present here is some of the initial findings from that. Kate will present that in a second, but I will talk a little bit more about the actual sample, what it looked like before Kate goes on to doing that. So as I mentioned, the original intention was to interview 45 people, and I had a 3x3 design in place. So I wanted to recruit 15 people from each of the 3 plurisexual identity groups, so bisexual, pansexual, and queer. And then I wanted to recruit 15 people from each of the 3 gender identity groups. So I had cisgendered men, cisgendered women, and trans people. And that trans people included trans men, trans women, non-binary, any other non-cisgendered identity. So that was my original intention. We never got to that, but I didn't either think it was a big problem either, because as I started conducting the interviews, and one of the exercises that we do at the beginning of the interview was an identity map, where the participant got to write all of the identities that they identified with. And in that, it became very obvious that even though each participant had gone through a screener process where they had told me what gender identity they identified with and what sexual identity they identified with. For gender identity, I allowed people to identify with more than one if they wanted to, but for sexual identity, I didn't for the screener, for the purpose of me wanting to fit them into the 3x3 sample. But what happened was that a lot of the participants had held more identities than what they had told me in the screener. So when we looked at the gender identity to begin with, sorry, just go back, if you just go back one slide, the majority of the sample was women, and then after that cisgender women, and after that cisgender men. But as you can see, there was a good representation of non-binary identity and trans identities within the sample as well. And then if you see, this was interesting, I think perhaps even more interesting when it came to their sexual identity. So they had kind of been forced into choosing one sexual identity for the screener for the purpose of me fitting them into these squares. But when it came to the identity map exercise during the interview, it became clear that the majority of them identified with more than one plurisexual identity. And they use different plurisexual identities depending on the social context. So some might say bisexual when they were talking to their parents, because their parents would never understand or not grasp what pansexual means or the difference between them. And then they would use them interchangeably. And for many participants, they meant kind of the same thing. But there was combinations of even bisexual, but also sometimes using gay and using, so there was a lot of combinations. So my 3x3 design didn't really work out in the end. Instead, there was much more fluidity, both in sexual identity and gender identity in this sample. which I welcome and makes for really interesting analysis anyway. Kate, on to the results.
Sure. So the couple of the main things that really have stood out so far is that there are a range of different desires among the folks in the sample. So there are about 48% of them, or 13 participants, mentioned explicitly that they would want to have children. We'll talk about what that means, or kind of pathways to parenthood, on the next slide. And then another 33%, or 9 participants, explicitly stated that they did not want children, they did not plan to have children. And there was a variety of different reasons that they cited in that, in terms of, in some cases, the social pressures and social expectations of having children to them wasn't a viable justification for pursuing parenthood, for example. There are other reasonings in terms of being very aware of their mental and physical health, and that they didn't feel that that was in line with, or something that would needed to have an added responsibility of parenthood and parenting along with that. And in some cases too, kind of the discussion as well of either how they'd made the decision with their current partner, or how relationships had come into play in terms of making that decision, either past or kind of their thoughts on future relationships as well. And then for the 3 folks who explicitly mentioned that they're unsure about it, there was kind of, again, this range of, maybe it's not quite in the cards in the present, but it's something that they've potentially thought about for the future. It's kind of dependent on, again, sometimes relationships, sometimes financial stuff. There's a couple different things that we'll kind of talk about on the next slide as well. So with all of those parenting intentions in mind, and kind of the way that it was split, interestingly enough, regardless of whether or not, because of how the questions were asked, we were able to kind of see that regardless of if someone mentioned that they planned to become a parent or not a parent, still 74% of the sample, so about 20 of the participants, said that in terms of family planning, family building, they saw adoption as an option or a viable potential going forward. So not necessarily something that they planned to do, but kind of something that they saw as a feasible thing. And in those that were more explicit about wanting to be parents and kind of wanting to pursue that way, their motivations for fostering and adoption tended to center around there already being either not wanting to bring more kids in the world, or feeling like if there's kids that already need parents and they want to be a parent, why not kind of put those 2 desires in line with each other and together. Now, of all the folks that mentioned wanting to be parents, there were a good, kind of all of them mentioned adoption, but there were a few that also discussed biological children as well, typically because of that preference towards adoption. In tandem, if they did have biological children, it would be maybe some bio children along with then some folks adopting as well. And then, though not everybody spoke about pregnancy or kind of biological children in a either combination or negative way, there was some discussion in terms of, again, the health side of things and the reasonings as to either the dysphoria or this discomfort, or in some cases explicitly just finding pregnancy gross or no interest in childbirth, as well as then concerns around family history of postpartum depression and their own health concerns around PCOS and infertility and other things that are kind of reproduction adjacent. But it's not just the reproduction side of things too. There was about a quarter of the sample, there was, whether it was a reason for not becoming a parent or it was a reason to delay becoming a parent, there was a discussion about the costs, both financially, especially explicitly financially, but then to the cost of time, the cost it might mean for career and other goals as well. So the intersection of these being a really important thing to pick up across all 3 of the parenting intentions, in terms of it not just being kind of a simple yes, no, maybe. And then for how those families kind of came to be, since I know we're sort of running close to time, there's a variety in what people saw. So there were quite a few people in the sample that were polyamorous and or non-monogamous, or in one case partnered with somebody who is non-monogamous, but they were monogamous with them. And so that didn't seem to hinder whether or not they would want to have a family. The quote that we have up on screen right now talked about that being part of their ideal bisexual dream, having that house with their multiple partners, raising kids together. And another participant mentioned too that being able to see someone else who is in a triad with kids gave them hope that they could retain kind of their polyamorous identity, as well as then their desire to become a parent and to be plurisexual as well. And in terms of the parenting side of things, so creating open and queer environments, making sure that their kids didn't experience the same things that they did, were free to explore who they were, as well as become more acquainted with queer culture from an earlier age. And then a couple of folks who mentioned too that the way in which families were built, especially with queer families, that there's kind of an excitement around the diversity within that, both from the standpoint of them being kind of an expanded family, as well as then one example in there is a participant who saw family not necessarily as bringing children into the world or into the mix, but how they were connected with other people, existing immediate family members and their partner, etc. So kind of the highlight of the current findings is really the intersection and the rich variations in there, that there's a mix of kind of seeing what the social expectations are, being aware of them, but not necessarily having those sway their decisions, as well as then the intersection of what current, past, and future relationships might do for parenting intentions. And then a couple of quick takeaways are, because of the skew of the existing literature towards lesbian and gay families, that it'd be good to ensure that there is bi-inclusive resources and plurisexual inclusive resources for adoption, fostering, and repro health spaces, as well as an acknowledgement and support for folks that have more than two parents within their households. So that's it for us.
Thank you so much. Does anyone have any burning questions, or shall we keep them until the end and do all of the questions together? I'll take that as no burning questions, and we will hear from Maisie, and then maybe there can be some time for discussion. So yeah, Maisie Matthews is our final speaker. Again, an ex-colleague of mine and also a future colleague, because she's just about to start her PhD at UCL. Maisie is currently a psychology student at the University of Cambridge, and today she'll be presenting on her MPhil research into bisexual fatherhood. And this research looks at bisexual fathers' identity and experiences using in-depth qualitative interviews.
Great, thank you, Ellen. Let me get myself up. Cool. So hi, I'm Maisie. Like Ellen said, I'm just starting my PhD at UCL, but this presentation is going to be focusing on my master's research that I did at the University of Cambridge. And so this research was one of the first to look in depth at experiences of identity in bisexual fatherhood. So in terms of previous literature on queer parenting, the focus has almost always been on gay and lesbian parents and kind of the effects of same-sex parenting on children. However, the majority of LGBT parents are bisexual, and so I kind of thought using this relationship framework doesn't really capture experiences of queer parenting. And so a review in 2013 of parenting research found that only 7 out of 422 articles on LGBT parenting referred specifically to bisexual parents. And then a more recent review in 2020 found that even though focused research on bisexual parents has increased, certain groups still remain underrepresented, such as bisexual fathers, parents of colour, and single parents. So I wanted my study to aim to focus on specifically bisexual fathers' experiences of their identity and the role they feel this plays in their parenthood. So this study aimed to be identity focused, data-driven, and reflexive. So I interviewed 24 bisexual fathers online and then conducted a reflexive thematic analysis. And overall, the sample was international, with participants in the USA, UK, Canada, and Poland, but did lack some demographic diversity, as the majority of participants were white, cisgender male, and were in relationship with women. So in terms of my findings, I identified 4 themes in the data, which encapsulate the different ways bisexual fathers spoke about coming to terms with and expressing their identity, and the ways in which fatherhood in particular presents certain issues and opportunities for identity work. So I'll now go into each theme into a bit more detail and their sub-themes. So the first theme is about the different ways in which bisexual fathers approached and described authenticity with regard to their identity. So the first aspect of authenticity that many fathers referred to was self-acceptance. And many found that coming to accept their bisexual identity took a long time, and lots described having previously suppressed their bisexuality, but then found that this started to have serious consequences for their physical and mental health. So then authenticity within the family was the second way in which fathers really valued, they found that coming out to their partners and children, things like that, were a really critical step for them to take before they could be publicly open. However, some did struggle with this feeling of wanting to be really authentic with their family, but also fears around this upsetting them or damaging their relationships in some way. And so then the final sort of way of fathers showing their authenticity was sort of public openness, and there was a lot of variation in terms of fathers' approaches to this. So many adapted their self-presentation across different contexts to achieve what's known as strategic outness. And so basically, most fathers described feeling that if they didn't outwardly disclose their bisexuality, they knew that other people would make assumptions based on their partner's gender. And in some situations, they actually sort of preferred this option as it offered sort of safety and invisibility and potentially could keep them safe from stigma. So this leads on to the second point, which is about the ways in which bisexual fathers deal with this kind of invisibility and the loneliness that it can bring. So lots of fathers referred to overall feelings of bisexual invisibility and erasure and feeling kind of isolated due to this, because they felt they didn't really have anyone with shared experiences. They felt excluded from both wider heterosexual society, but also excluded from sort of gay and LGBT spaces. However, many did value the opportunities they could find for safe self-expression. So this allowed them to embrace their bisexual identity without feeling at risk of sort of public stigma or exclusion. So for some fathers, this involved things like seeking understanding communities. So this could be things like local groups of other LGBT parents or sort of pride networks at work. And these allowed them to sort of share their experiences with people with common ground, but not have to necessarily be open in all situations. And fathers also described signaling their bisexuality to others through things like pride badges and flags, and found that just knowing that sort of if you know was a way for them to think, okay, I'm expressing my identity and I'm part of a wider community without having to have these really explicit conversations. And then one particularly critical part of fathers' sort of self-expression and community expression I found was the use of online platforms. So I found that lots of fathers use these sort of online spaces to get in touch with other bisexual men or fathers across the world and sort of share their similar experiences while still maintaining this comfortable level of anonymity. So this is a way that they were able to balance expressing their identity as a bisexual man whilst not compromising the sort of safeness that they needed as a father. So then the third theme I found was about the ways in which bisexual fathers talked about reconciling their bisexual identity with these sort of wide ideas about being a father and being part of a family. So lots of bisexual fathers spoke about feeling there were really these typical assumptions and images of what both fatherhood and bisexuality should look like, and felt these were often presented as incompatible. And so many found they didn't personally fit typical images of fatherhood and masculinity, such as like the roles and attitudes they took towards parenting. And some also felt that being a father actually excluded them from the LGBT community, because lots of sort of queer spaces and events aren't really centered around parents or families and weren't really accessible to them. And so this kind of sense of incompatibility between the two aspects of their identity was something that prevented lots of bisexual fathers from being more open and coming out earlier, because they felt there were no positive role models of bisexual men who could also be good fathers. But for some of the fathers that I spoke to, this was actually motivation for them to reframe the idea of a traditional family. So they felt that if they could sort of value the strengths of their bisexuality and focus on this as a parent, this could do things like challenging gender norms in their family roles or sort of modeling a different form of masculinity to their children. And they felt this came more naturally to them as they kind of spent the time questioning and interrogating their own identity. And they saw that this could be a positive way to use their sort of identity, their experiences of marginalized identity in their parenting, rather than letting these two things sort of be dichotomized. And so then this final theme looks at the particular significance of interactions across generations. So lots of fathers talked about when they had these sort of community experiences like those online or with other parents, they really referred to the idea of kind of having role models and representation and how important it was to speak to people with slightly different experiences to themselves and how this helped them to understand and accept their own identity. So it seemed that things like age and upbringing really shaped how fathers thought about their identity. And so by talking to maybe like older bisexual fathers or younger bisexual fathers helped them to kind of have this unique space for identity work and identity talk. So many fathers expressed a desire to provide representation for younger bisexual fathers, as themselves they'd grown up with no role models and they found this really difficult and isolating. So this is termed in the literature as queer generativity, and this is the idea of wanting to do better for future generations of LGBT people and trying to sort of provide this through own behaviour. And this can then also be useful for the individual to sort of solidify and validate their own queer identity. And so fathers also reflected on their own upbringing and the attitudes of their generation and their parents. And many referred to wanting to do better than their parents. For example, offering support to their child, being more open about gender and sexuality, as they wanted to kind of undo the problems that they'd had as a child and do better for the next generation. And so linking to this, many fathers reported that actually interacting with their child was a really good way for them to come to understand and validate their own identities. So particularly quite a few mentioned their own children come out to them as queer or LGBT. And they found that this actually was really significant in helping them to come to terms with their own identity. Because firstly, there was sort of the feeling as a father, they should be a good role model, they should be open so that their child also feels more comfortable. But also they talked about having this kind of glimpse into a future generation and seeing how younger people were a lot more open and comfortable with their sexuality. And this helped them to start to feel more positively about themselves. So it seems like parenting sort of created this unique space and intergenerational interaction that actually was really important to them developing their identity. So in conclusion, I found that bisexual identity and fatherhood do seem to interact in some ways, and this can be both bisexuality shaping approaches to parenting, but also parenting itself sort of highlighting the significance of a father's identity and impacting how they interact with this identity and the wider LGBT community. And my research also highlighted the importance of supportive communities and safe self-expression. So for a lot of fathers, the most positive things that they spoke to me about were things like talking to other bisexual fathers or being able to express their identity in a way that they weren't able to when they were younger. And so this shows that kind of whilst there can be these really difficult parts of having a marginalized identity, actually there are important ways that this can bring people together. And so whilst many fathers did find that societal stigma was really significant in kind of impacting how they express themselves and sometimes preventing them from coming out earlier, there seems to be some hope for this, that actually a lot of them had these really positive outlets. And so overall, I found that it seems that parents' individual queer identity, not only just having, say, two same-sex parents, actually even having just one queer parent might have a really influential impact on the way that family roles and dynamics and stuff take place. So I think that's something that I'd really like to look at in future research. So in terms of implications, the complex issues that fathers described as related to their marginalized identity indicate that there are some real difficulties still for bisexual fathers. And although we might think that kind of attitudes towards LGBT parents are improving, actually it seems that a lot of these fathers still have real difficulties. But if we can also try and signpost the supportive communities that do exist, so things like online communities that are really important to the fathers in my study, this seems to be able to help reduce feelings of isolation and mental health problems that some fathers reported. And so then in terms of future research, I think it'd be really valuable to look at the experiences of other family members and see how they find that their father's identity impacts wider family dynamics. And to do this using quantitative measures such as measuring each family member's psychological well-being, and also using more diverse samples to do this. And so this will be the focus of my PhD research as I go to kind of expand this study into getting a more broad understanding of how bisexual father families experience their father's identity. So thank you very much for listening. And yeah, let me know if you have any questions. I'd really like to hear other people's perspectives on this. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Maisie. It's been such a nice panel having 3 people who I've worked with. So it really is nice to have these friendly faces. Did anyone have any burning questions for Maisie? Or I will read out the question for Kate and Mark from the chat.
I wish I knew how to stop sharing my screen. There we go.
I will read out the question for Mark and Kate then, and then if there's any other questions, we can come back to that as we kind of have to wrap up soon. So the question for Mark and Kate is about methodology. So Mona says that they haven't heard of anyone using identity mapping in an interview before, and they'd like to hear more about using that methodology.
Yeah,
sorry, messages keep coming through. Yeah, I'm assuming you've seen it.
I can take that question also because I did the interview and actually I saw it before, so I actually prepared. So if you don't mind, I'll share just quickly. So this is what they look like. So I actually just quickly interested in, I used 3 different exercises and I didn't come up with them myself. They are, my PhD is modeled on a large scale study in the US called the Generation Study, which our supervisor that we all share, myself and Kate, used in their generation study that looked at LGBT people. So the identity map is very simple, it looks like this. Essentially, that was my interpretation of it. And the participant is just asked to write all the identities that they hold relating to, we prompted them to talk about identities related to sexual identity and gender identity because that was important, but all other identities. And the great thing with this map, so they spent some time writing all the identities that they have. Some wrote just a handful, some wrote, like on the right-hand side, loads and loads of identities. And then we use this map to talk about intersectionality. So it's a lot about talking, for example, about what it's like to be a trans person, but also from an ethnic minority community. What is it like to be bisexual as a male, for example. So talking about intersectionalities between these identities was a really good instrument. But we also, just to, if you're interested in methodology, I actually started off each interview with a lifeline drawing, which I don't know either if you've seen before. So this was looking at your life and drawing a line from your birth into today. And when it goes up, it was something positive, down something negative, and kind of straight, kind of a neutral time in your life. And then labeling peak times like turning points and highs and lows throughout this. So that was how we started each interview, talking through the lifeline for kind of get a broader sense of the participant's life up until that point. And then we went to identity maps, and then we went on to the one that I developed myself, which is a sexual orientation configuration. But if you're interested in that, I can talk about that some other time, because that was kind of to understand the difference, the variety and diversity that exists within plurisexual identifying people, and how some might be more attracted to certain gender expressions than others, and so forth. So it's trying to get to that as well. So those were the 3 different exercises that we used within the interviews. If anyone is interested,
thank you so much for that, Mark.
Separately. Yeah. Right.
I love how prepared you were, that you had it all on the screen ready to share. That really made my job very easy. Are there any more questions? I guess if we have no more questions, then people can take a 2-minute break before the next keynote. So do join the keynote. It's between me and Christian Kless, who will be talking about polysexual people and non-monogamies. So do join our next keynote if you are interested in that. And thank you all for coming to this session.